About 10 minutes after 10, Booth began to mount the stairs leading up to the second tier of boxes where you would find President Lincoln.
Welcome to Watch Mojo. Today we're looking at the most infamous assassination plots, successful and failed, that were later discovered to have been conspired by groups of people.
As the crowd tries to subdue Princip, the Archduke and his wife are left bleeding in the car.
Alexei Navalny.
This is so smart, because even reasonable people, they refuse to believe, like, what? Come on, poisoned?
Of all the domestic critics of Vladimir Putin's government, political leader Alexei Navalny is arguably the most prominent. Few of his supporters were surprised when he became violently ill during a flight in August 2020. Doctors induced a coma and determined that Navalny had been poisoned by what was later identified as a nerve agent.
You knew in that moment that you'd been poisoned.
Yes.
Quick thinking from the pilot saves his life. Instead of flying on to Moscow, still 3 hours away, the plane diverts to Omsk.
The patient was soon evacuated to Germany, where he made a remarkable recovery. Immediately, suspicions arose that this was an assassination attempt by the Russian government. An international journalistic investigation later concluded that FSB operatives had indeed surveilled and poisoned Navalny, among other dissidents. Shortly after, Navalny returned to Russia and was promptly arrested. In February 2024, the Russian Penitentiary Service reported that he died in prison.
In prison, Navalny complained about poor treatment and staged hunger strikes. Despite being locked up, Navalny continued to be a vocal critic of the Kremlin.
Iran chain murders. By the end of the 1980s, Iran's system had accrued many prominent dissidents. Among them was Health Minister Qasem Soleimani, who was murdered in what seemed like a random act of violence in 1988. Over the next decade, over 80 critics died in car accidents, robberies, and other incidents. By the time an opposition party leader and 4 other people were murdered in a span of 2 months, the public demanded an investigation. 18 supposedly rogue intelligence agents were ultimately prosecuted for orchestrating these chain killings and assassination attempts. Subsequent journalistic inquiries implicated state officials, resulting in severe retaliation. Despite this, the revelations emboldened the reformist sentiments that the killings sought to curb. Even today, there are still controversial mysteries surrounding this 10-year operation. Fred Hampton.
Fred Hampton was murdered by his government. But before that, he was a leader in a movement practicing a new kind of activism.
As deputy chairman of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton was a highly visible opponent of the American status quo. He was asleep in his apartment in 1969 when police engaged his security during a raid for illegal weapons. Hampton was injured in the crossfire, then shot twice in the head at point-blank range.
The next thing I remember was someone in our room shaking Chairman Fred. Chairman, wake up, wake up. Plaster was flying off the wall. You could smell the cordite from the gunshot.
Several legal inquiries attributed Hampton and Mark Clark's deaths to the chaotic scene. However, accusations of deliberate murder were later supported by the exposure of COINTELPRO in 1971.
Authorities initially claimed the Panthers had opened fire on the police who were there to serve a search warrant for weapons. Evidence later emerged that told a very different story.
This FBI operation aimed at illegally undermining political movements was particularly interested in the BPP. Through the years, overwhelming evidence has suggested that the real purpose of the raid was to assassinate Hampton. The organizations responsible have yet to formally admit this. Operation Nemesis. Truly, the Armenian genocide was one of the most heinous conspiracies of the 20th century.
An overwhelming number of historians say that Turkey's rulers committed genocide, that its actions were a model for what Hitler did to the Jews. The Turks, meanwhile, say their ancestors never carried out such crimes.
Nearly 2 years after the massacre, former Azerbaijani Prime Minister Vətəli Hanhosky was murdered. Several other political figures of the former Ottoman Empire would be killed over the next 2 years.
They gunned down leaders in Berlin, Rome, Tbilisi, Constantinople, and then they just disappeared. They did this for about 2 years, 1921, 1922, and gone.
Members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation eventually took credit for these slayings as retaliation against masterminds of the genocide. Interestingly, only a few of the targets had been formally charged with the crime. Named for the Greek goddess of retribution, Operation Nemesis continues to be scrutinized. Turkey and Azerbaijan, whose governments do not recognize the Armenian genocide, condemn the campaign as terrorism. In Armenia, however, the conspirators are officially recognized as national heroes. Alexander Litvinenko. Disillusioned with what he termed Putin's mafia state, Alexander Litvinenko, an organized crime specialist with the FSB, fled to the UK, where he later became a naturalized citizen. In his new home, Litvinenko continued to collaborate with British authorities to expose the Russian mafia and reveal government corruption. A few years later, Litvinenko was poisoned with radioactive material, which he succumbed to.
But unlike most murder victims, he was able to give extensive interviews to British detectives before he died.
Numerous conspiracy theories ensued as criminal investigations implicated multiple agents with the Russian government. The Litvinenko Justice Foundation spent years collecting hard evidence that they were acting on direct orders from the FSB. This incident ultimately deteriorated relations between the UK and Russia. In 2021, the European Court of Human Rights formally recognized the Russian government's responsibility for Litvinenko's murder.
The trail of polonium traces leads not just from London to Moscow, but directly to the door of Vladimir Putin's office.
Operation Condor. The Cold War was an era of political upheaval throughout the world. Some of the most brutal upheaval came under the quietest influence by powerful states. 7 South American countries were particularly wrought by dictatorial uprisings and political assassination through the 1970s and 80s.
Amongst the victims here, Argentines, Uruguayans, Bolivians, Chileans, and Cubans. This was the center for Plan Condor in Argentina.
This escalated with the official initiation of Operation Condor in '75. As early as 1968, however, the U.S. government began covertly assisting regime changes to strengthen relations with nearby nations and suppress left-wing movements. The systems this inspired in no way resembled the pro-democracy image of American diplomacy.
Military dictatorships had seized power in the region and employed any method necessary to combat the perceived communist threat.
Decades of declassification and investigation have linked tens of thousands of deaths, including assassinations, to the CIA. The end of these dictatorships would not be the end of the US-backed terror. Abraham Lincoln.
About 10 minutes after 10, Booth began to mount the stairs leading up to the second tier of boxes, where you would find President Lincoln.
April 15, 1865 was one of the most shocking days in American history. Actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth snuck into Ford's Theater and fatally shot President Abraham Lincoln. It turns out this murder went beyond a political gesture. After Booth's death and pursuit, 8 people were tried on suspicion of plotting the assassination. The immense trial revealed that George Atzerodt, David Herold, and Lewis Powell attempted to simultaneously kill the Vice President and Secretary of State. They believed this would destabilize the Union enough to reignite the concluding Civil War.
What was the object of the conspiracy? It was essentially to accomplish what the Confederacy had failed to accomplish on the battlefield, and that was to win the war.
These men, alongside Mary Surratt, whose guilt is still in dispute, were convicted and executed for the ultimately failed plot.
Surratt was the first woman sentenced to death by the U.S. government.
History now mostly remembers Booth's tragically successful part. Operation Wrath of God.
Just outside the Olympic Village in Munich, West Germany, the peace of what have been called the Serene Olympics was shattered just before dawn this morning, about 5 o'clock.
In 1972, the Palestinian militant group Black September kidnapped 11 Israeli participants in the Munich Olympics. None of them survived the crisis. Afterwards, suspected conspirators in Black September and the Palestine Liberation Organization were killed around the world.
Are you Father Sayeta? Yes, and are you? Do you know why we're here?
Following the discovery of evidence in 1973 that indicated the innocence of one victim, an investigation uncovered Operation Wrath of God. Prime Minister Golda Meir personally sanctioned these Mossad-coordinated assassinations in response to the Munich massacre.
Oui? Yes?
The intelligence also led to Operation Spring of Youth, a bloody raid of PLO leaders' homes in Lebanon. These campaigns revealed the efficiency of Israeli intelligence, but simultaneously provoked retaliations and tarnished Israel's political reputation. The full scope of Operation Wrath of God remains a mystery. Franz Ferdinand. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was riding through Sarajevo when Gavrilo Princip shot him and his wife dead.
As the crowd tries to subdue Princip, the Archduke and his wife are left bleeding in the car.
It was a chance encounter, but not an entirely coincidental one. Princip was part of a 6-man team that failed to hit Ferdinand's motorcade earlier that day.
There are a few injuries, but Ferdinand and his wife are unharmed.
Their weapons were later linked to the Serbian nationalist group, the Black Hand. The conspiracy might have involved even more parties. Their ultimate objective was to compromise Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia and inspire South Slavic unification. The assassination only escalated the empire's conflicts with the regional authorities, especially as the Archduke was a staunch peace advocate. His death ultimately became the catalyst for World War I.
Austria-Hungary seeks support from Germany. Germany agrees, and Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, Serbia's ally, mobilizes its forces, and as a result, Germany declares war on Russia. Russia's ally, France, then mobilizes its forces, which causes Germany to declare war on France.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. July 20th plot. Of the over 40 assassination attempts made on the leader of the Nazi regime, the loftiest came from within.
Stauffenberg entered the conference room. Exactly 7 minutes later, the world would be forever changed.
On July 20th, 1944, a briefcase planted in Adolf Hitler's headquarters exploded, but only caused minor injuries to him as it was moved at the last moment. Thus ended years of planning by hundreds of people, mostly from the military. Their intention was to frame the Nazi Party for the bombing, then overthrow the government in Operation Valkyrie. The plot's motivation, however, is still disputed. Some conspirators were disillusioned by the Third Reich's atrocities, while others merely sought to resolve World War II in Germany's favor. Either way, their failed operation came closest to killing Hitler, before he did the deed himself 9 months later. What do you think of these and other proven conspiracies? Join the discussion in the comments.
Litvinenko's accusation against Putin was made public on the day he died. The Russian leader instantly denied it, and even suggested there was no evidence that Litvinenko had in fact been murdered.
Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.